Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm taking a look at Apocalypse. Obviously, the person in the clip right now isn't Apocalypse, that's Abomination. I actually forgot to record the clip of Apocalypse in the main menu when he was released because he just kind of sucked and I never really got around to doing it. I was testing him when he released, but he was just in such a poor state, and by the time that I finished my testing, it was already apparent to everyone just how bad he was, that there wasn't really a point for me to make a video. I decided to wait it out and see if they would buff him to cover any kind of testing for him afterwards. Thankfully, they did buff him, and they added penetration and healing to his 5th skill as opposed to his 4th skill, which is a pretty significant difference because his AI didn't really prioritize the 4th skill at all, meaning that he didn't really have any healing for a native character, which is kind of unheard of. Thankfully, now he is usable in PvP content, and that's pretty much what I'll be covering in the video, as well as some testing regarding his performance in PvE. I don't have a completely maxed out build on Apocalypse yet. I'm still trying to decide whether I want to invest further into him, but I do have a pretty good build on him. I have Odin's in every slot, a Mighty Conquest, and a 4-star artifact. For the first test I did, I went to a stage 35 of Null without using a leadership or supports, and he honestly didn't do that well for a native. He was able to clear this with about 60 seconds remaining, but if he had any good kind of performance in PvE, he should be able to clear this with over a minute and 30 seconds remaining, if not more than that. I wouldn't really recommend Apocalypse for PvE considering the value that he has in PvP is greater, but if you do want to build him for that, then you can utilize either a CTP of Rage, a CTP of Judgment because his skills deal element damage, or even something like a CTP of Energy or Destruction because his rotation is fairly quick and you can cancel skills one after another into one final skill. Considering that his value in Alliance Battle didn't seem that great when I tested him either, then I would probably recommend either a Judgment or a Destruction to push in things like World Boss Legend. But even there, you're not really going to get much value out of him because he doesn't really perform at the higher stages where you really want him to. With the level 80 upgrade, he was able to clear the same stage about 2 minutes faster, which is kind of the standard for a level 70 to level 80 upgrade. Because the clear time is so quick at the lower stages, to get a better idea of how much of an improvement the tier 4 provides, I took him into a stage 54, this time using his leadership but no supports. He was able to clear this with roughly around a minute and 30 seconds left. Just to make sure that the performance improvement is accurate, I also did a stage 39 of Kang, this time using his own leadership and 2 supports, and he's able to complete the first phase of that fight within about 4 minutes or with 60 seconds remaining. Apocalypse seems to be the kind of character that you need to kind of max out in order to get the most consistent value out of him in PvP. Luckily, if you do decide to tier 4 him, the character gets some pretty good stat bumps across the board. His HP increases by a considerable amount, by roughly around 20,000, and his energy attack also increases by 15,000 because he deals energy damage, not physical damage as most combat types do. In terms of the character strikers for PvE, you can just swap in the top ones, so that would be ones like Thor and Ghost Rider when you decide to use him in PvE, but for PvP, there isn't really any good characters that have the destruction instinct type that you want to leave on the character because most of them don't have iframe ignore or penetration on the striker skill. So you can potentially swap in a good PvP striker like the ones I've mentioned in other videos, but the one that I decided to leave on him is Ebony Maw because the 5th skill has some pretty good burst damage on it and because it also has some CC effects. So you can pretty much use, again, anyone that you want there. Doesn't really matter too much because he won't go into the tier 4 too often. With that tier 4 upgrade on stage 54 of Null, he was able to clear the same stage about a minute and 10 seconds faster. Regarding his rotation, I do a 1 and 2 cancel to fill up the ultimate faster, then do a 3 cancel, 4 cancel, 5. Once you have the ultimate skill, the rotation changes a little bit. I do a 5 delay cancel when you see the animation start, and then do a 3 cancel, 4 cancel, 6 or the ultimate skill. The reason that you do a delay cancel of the 5th skill is because you have to wait a little bit for the damage to be dealt from it or appear from the skill that you normally wouldn't have to worry about in the other rotation because you're finishing with that skill. When you fill up your tier 4 skill, you basically want to use that whenever it's available to get the most out of the striker skill. With the tier 4 upgrade on this stage, I was able to get to that same 30 health bar mark or complete the first phase about a minute and 40 seconds faster. So it seems that the tier 4 upgrade provides him anywhere from a minute and 10 second to a minute and 40 second improvement, with a difference of around 30 seconds, but that varies depending on the world boss legend stages that you fight and the different animations and interruptions that you experience there. It's worth noting that using his leadership and 2 supports and not having a damage proc, I wasn't even close to completing this stage and ran out of time with around 16 health bars left. The reason that this is significant is because he is a native tier 2 character, and when I tested pretty much the same stage with Captain America, I was almost able to complete it, and I think I had about 2 to 4 health bars left with him. Captain America isn't a native tier 2 character, Apocalypse is. He's way more expensive, so he should be able to be even more versatile and be more effective in being able to decide how players want to use him, whether it's for PvE or PvP. It doesn't make sense that a more expensive character is much less useful in pretty much all content than a character that isn't a native tier 2 and is less expensive. Ironically, for the longest time, Apocalypse was meta for ABX on the combat villain day. However, now he isn't really even close to being meta for that day because he just doesn't have enough hits on his skills and doesn't really compete with the current characters available, which again is kind of unfortunate for a native character where he can only really be used for one thing or another, where he's expensive enough that he should be justified to be used for whatever players want to use him for. Apocalypse does have all the cancel effects for the different seasons, but at level 70 I was only able to score around 9 million or so without a damage proc. Usually I should be able to score around 10 million if they're more viable in the mode, and then when I took him to tier 4 I was only able to score around the 11 million mark, which again should be higher if the character can be used for things like ABX. Keep in mind that characters like Hulk, for example, can score pretty much 14 or 15 million without a damage proc. They're not a native and perform much better than Apocalypse, who is again way more expensive than the other characters that can be used in the same modes. So naturally, if the character doesn't excel in PvE, then he must excel at PvP to a high level. But obviously that wasn't the case before, and it isn't exactly the case now. He does have a lot going for him. He has really high damage reduction, he has the incapacitation immunity, he also has super guard break on his 2nd and 5th skill, pretty much the only skills that he uses on rotation. He has iframe ignore counter on the 2nd skill, and he has healing and invincible on the 5th skill. It's obviously important and worth noting that he gained penetration on the 2nd skill, which was one of the things that most players, including myself, were urging the devs to change, because a counter skill or even a native character without penetration in their kit just doesn't work in the current meta when a lot of characters can spam invincible in just their skills, let alone their builds, and make native characters essentially useless if they can't go through the invincible of the opponent. I still think the penetration value should have been much higher for native characters. It should start at a base of maybe 50 or 60% and go as high as 80 or 100% depending on whether it's on a passive, a skill, or something else. Aside from this, the character also has value because he has a passive debuff, so that he not only applies it to himself but also other mutant characters. And more importantly, if you want to get the most value out of the character, then you definitely need his artifact, because him reviving and having a second chance to take out the opponent is very critical for his value in PvP. Believe it or not, Apocalypse struggled to take out even just one life of Surfer and Sentry, but now with the added penetration on the 2nd skill and the healing to improve his survivability on the 5th skill, allow him to survive things like Surfer's Reflect enough to be able to at least take out one life of him, and potentially also avoid some of the CC lockdown or knockups and super guard break that Sentry has, even though Apocalypse is at level 80 and the other characters that I've tested here were at tier 4. Apocalypse definitely does gain a noticeable value when you get him to tier 4, where he previously could only take one life of a meta character. In some cases he could take 2, he now can consistently take 2 of their lives, and potentially even take out a full team. This is pretty considerable in things like Alliance Conquest and Otherworld Battle, because it can mean the difference between just wiping a team to potentially winning and saving up your other characters for other teams. And obviously in Otherworld Battle, it means the difference between a loss and an actual win. Didn't really test out too many of the build options for the character in PvP, but from what I noticed in his kit and the other Apocalypse characters that I fought, his two most ideal options seem to be a CTP of Conquest or a CTP of Authority. The CTP of Conquest makes sense for his kit because he already has high base damage reduction, and because he frequently spams other defensive things like Invincible and healing from his 5th skill, which also synergize with the Conquest because it provides him with more base health as well as increasing that healing from the recovery rate provided. Because his base damage reduction is so high, being 45%, it means that you can also utilize something like a Steel CTP of Authority. Ideally, if you can get a brilliant one, it means you can basically sort of cap it out and get that pseudo immortality effect for 5 seconds. But you have to keep in mind that this CTP doesn't necessarily synergize with him as well as the Conquest does, because he spams the 5th skill that already has Invincible on it, so that doesn't benefit him too much. And unlike a Conquest, he doesn't gain immunity to Reflect, so if he gets knocked out of any of his skills, which have pretty good lingering damage on them, he can potentially just end up dying from Reflect damage that way. But I have noticed that in Otherworld Battle, a Steel CTP of Authority tends to outperform a Conquest, so if you use him there, then you might gain more value going with that build instead of the other one. I could be wrong, but I don't think that a CTP of Greed is that effective for him because his skills aren't really too quick, and he does need the 2nd skill to activate the counterpart for him to actually deal damage, and oftentimes versus meta characters he can actually be knocked out of it, so the Greed won't really do much of anything. Even when he revives, he's still dependent on the same thing, so you don't really get as much value out of it as you would from characters that have faster skills or burst damage. You could potentially also try something like CTP of Regen. It won't nearly be as good as the other options for the character as a solo character, but if you want to use him more in regards to a support character because he has that debuff passive, then you can use a CTP of Regeneration with the penetration effect, and use a stronger main damage dealing character in things like Alliance Conquest or Otherworld Battle. Things like a Regen or Refinement can also work, but won't nearly be as effective as the other options I mentioned if you want to make him a solo character, because he only has healing limited to his 5th skill as opposed to other meta characters having access to multiple healing skills or skills that they can spam that healing or have healing passively, which Apocalypse doesn't. He only just has a high health pool and healing limited to the 5th skill. But despite the build that you choose on the character, you can see that Apocalypse definitely has some use in PvP now, either in Alliance Conquest or Otherworld Battle. Sadly, he isn't consistent enough to even be close to breaking the top 5 meta for things like Timeline. If you decide to play the character on manual, I wouldn't recommend doing so because there are so many better characters, but if you decide to do that, I'd recommend that you open with the 3rd skill to get some protection from the barrier hit shield that it provides, and then going into the 2nd skill right after for the obvious iframe ignore counter, as well as gaining damage immunity and having that super guard break lockdown. From there, I would alternate using the 5th skill and then the 2nd skill, and just repeating that back and forth so that you can get the protections from the 3rd skill and the 5th skill. You can't really use the same skill on repeat, starting, for example, the 3rd and the 5th, because the opponent will revive too quickly. And you don't want to spam the 5th skill too often on repeat because you also want the healing from it and the invincible, obviously. With some luck, if you pull off these skills properly, you should be able to take out some meta teams with just Apocalypse and not really having to use other characters or swapping out. I did mention that Apocalypse is useful in Alliance Conquest, but some of the tests that I had kind of proved me wrong in a sense. However, it was mostly, I think, because the character has a little bit more value as a support character than as a main damage dealing character. So if you do use Apocalypse on a team, make sure to have another good, strong character on there. Otherwise, he might be more inconsistent than you think. For example, when I tested him versus Deadpool, he didn't seem to be able to perform as well versus him as he should, even though he has a type advantage. It appears that Deadpool has a lot more survival and can potentially one-shot counter him with his iframe ignore skill, because Apocalypse just stays in long iframe skills and allows Deadpool to basically do that. Even though Apocalypse has 2 lives with his artifact, he doesn't seem to be a great matchup versus Thanos, because Thanos can spam his iframe ignore so quickly when Apocalypse just stays in his iframe skills and immediately will get hit out of them and potentially just end up dying. One thing that is important to note with Apocalypse though is that because he has that support debuff capability, you can utilize some pretty useful leaderships. For example, you can use She-Hulk if you're fighting characters that are male type and it can't be removed from Molecule Man, as well as also using characters like Polaris, for example, if you're fighting villain opponents like Thanos, for example, or in better cases, the next team that I end up testing against. So using Apocalypse versus characters like Gore and Hulk seem to be pretty effective. You can utilize She-Hulk versus the both of them, and because Hulk stays out of iframes with his latest uniform, it allows Apocalypse to stack up multiple amounts of his skills and debuff both characters. Polaris would likely be a better leadership in this situation because you gain a damage improvement versus all the characters as opposed to just Captain America for the most part and Falcon. But you can see that Apocalypse obviously isn't completely useless, since he is also able to take out a full team by himself, including the new Zombies team, which actually synergizes pretty well and can do some pretty crazy things, as you'll see from a later video that I'll show for those characters. This season, the character is also very valuable in Otherworld Battle because he not only provides a debuff passive to your entire team if you use mutants, not really to anyone else, but the character also having revive and being pretty decent standalone means that you have more of a chance to win because he can not only lock down opponents but also has that iframe ignore with super guard break both on the 2nd skill and the 5th skill. I still think they could have done more for Apocalypse and even Doctor Doom. Like I've said multiple times in this video, native tier 2 characters and tier 3 characters should have the flexibility of being built in any way that players want to because of their high cost. They should be allowed to be built for PvE or PvP and should be able to excel in either game mode depending on how the players build them. Similar to Doctor Doom, I don't really recommend that people build Apocalypse unless they are really into Alliance Conquest or Otherworld Battle. I don't really see the value of the character in other game modes, including things like Timeline. I would actually recommend that people build Captain America before him because he is much cheaper, and if they have access to weapon hacks, he does form a pretty strong team in Alliance Conquest, potentially stronger than Apocalypse with other characters. I also think that Doctor Doom is better than Apocalypse because he is a universal type, so he doesn't have those disadvantages. He also doesn't need his artifact to perform well, whereas Apocalypse does, and it seems that Doctor Doom and Apocalypse both are kind of wild cards in terms of their performance in Alliance Conquest, but I have seen Doctor Doom perform some pretty crazy things that I haven't seen Apocalypse do the same yet. That is pretty much Apocalypse. He is now usable, but like Doctor Doom, isn't nearly where he should be for a native character. The next character that I'll be looking at is Weapon Hex. She actually got a pretty massive improvement in terms of performance, not only in PvP, but also usability in things like PvE, either as a solo character or a support. If you enjoyed this video, found it entertaining or useful, please make sure to like and subscribe, and share this with others. It can potentially help them out, and it definitely helps my channel grow. As always, I appreciate people taking the time to watch my videos, so thank you, but the video is now over.